Haiti is always described as the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. But during its height as Saint-Domingue, it was the richest place in the Americas. The thing about it, though, is that this richness was all rooted in slaves. Its wealth was based on human capital, on owning that human capital.
All day, as long as the sun is shining, the men are bending over and swaying a machete at the foot of the sugarcane.
The world as you know it disappears. Therefore you become an animal, and you expect to live like an animal.
The dominion of the master had to be absolute, but that absoluteness itself made the master into something other than human as well.
Liberty, equality, fraternity, that was new for the world. Toussaint Louverture recruited about 3,000 to 4,000 people, trained them, and they fought the French, the British, and the Spanish army for 12 years.
They burned the mechanisms of their production. They're burning the plantation fields, burning down the houses.
It was a wholesale massacre on a really, really enormous scale.
The Haitian Revolution is probably the most profound revolution ever realized by human beings. The only place where slaves created a nation. But nobody wants to talk about it.
The decisive event that affected all of culture at the time, it has to be the first successful slave revolution in human history, and the successful break from European imperial powers, and that's the Haitian War of Independence that breaks out in August 1791.
The other thing I think just to remember is that this was the most successful colony in the Americas. I mean, we think of it today as it's the poorest nation in the Americas. It's always talked about in those terms. At that time, it really was the richest site. It wasn't a nation of its own, but the richest colony in the Americas. The productivity was enormous. So for every, in a sense, empire in the Americas, in a sense, had their eye on it, would have loved to be able to take control of that sector of the economy. The first stage of the revolution in 1791 was essentially about the slaves establishing control over these plantation domains. They transformed these wealthy plantations into their camps. One of the most interesting things that African historians have suggested about the revolution is that one of the reasons it may have succeeded is that there were huge numbers of men who had served in armies in Africa, who had been soldiers in Africa, who had been enslaved as a result of after participating in wars in Africa, and they brought their military experience to Saint-Domingue.
1793, Britain and France went to war, and Britain saw a chance to do two things in one go: to seize this very wealthy territory for itself, away from its enemy France, and to suppress the slave revolt before it could spread to Jamaica, which was very close by. Huge British force headed for Saint-Domingue, and for 5 years they fought the rebel slaves there who came under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture, the great Haitian leader, and they lost.
The attempted repression of that revolt involved hundreds of thousands of English boys and young men who were shipped off to Haiti. And there they will meet at the other end of a bayonet or the other end of a machete, the historic indignation of slaves fighting for freedom.
The British defeat was in a sense presaged the defeat of Napoleon's troops that would follow a few years later. This is really one of the foundational moments in the history of not just the Americas politically, but in democratic theorizing, of philosophy, of thinking about what rights are. So not only do you have a challenge to racist ideas that kind of consign people to the margins of history rather than placing them at the center, but you also have to rethink, I think, a lot of broader narratives about Western history.
What's interesting about the Haitian Revolution is that it's the only revolution with the only constitution that outlaws slavery and outlaws discrimination on the basis of race. Now that is historic. That's not in the Bill of Rights in the US. It's not part of the unwritten constitution of the British Empire. But it's part of that history of opposing racism, which actually comes from the enslaved themselves, and not from the so-called humanitarian efforts.
The cost they paid for it was a terrible one, because there was this international boycott of Haiti, and in the end they had to pay reparations. So it's not that reparations were paid to the slaves. They had to pay reparations to the French for property expropriated and so forth. So here's the only successful slave revolution in history, and basically, okay, we are going to make sure that the contagion of your example does not spread to the United States, does not spread to Latin America. We're going to isolate you, we're going to quarantine you, we're going to make you pay.